If I were to describe a trilogy of movies that came out in the early 2000s that dealt in themes of temptation, war, friendship, were directed by a bearded man with glasses, and relied heavily on new CGI technology, what series would I be describing? The good news is there are two correct answers to this question: the Lord of the Rings series and the Star Wars prequels. I recently finished a Lord of the Rings watch through with my friends, and during it, I started thinking that it accomplished a lot of things that the Star Wars prequels failed to do. One aspect of this is that I found the VFX side of these stories to be very similar. Both of these series came into being during a time when special effects was undergoing a large paradigm shift due to the increasing prevalence of CGI technology. Part of what drew George Lucas back into filmmaking was his fascination with CGI advances made during the 80s and early 90s. Likewise, Peter Jackson felt that CGI technology had advanced to a point that he could portray a realistic-looking and mature fantasy world, at least compared to what had come before it. There are differences in the paths these two trilogies took. The prequels are often criticized for their overuse of digital sets, while Lord of the Rings caused a tourism boom in New Zealand. Granted, New Zealand is so close to being a fantasy country that it gets left out of maps on Earth, and there isn't really a place you can shoot on location for Camino. The prequels are often criticized for the "it's so dense" line that one of the producers made in an interview about the production of Revenge of the Sith. I found it really interesting that the density that the prequels are often criticized for is often celebrated and is one of my favorite aspects about Lord of the Rings. One reason I can see for this is that Lord of the Rings did a much better job of balancing practical and digital effects. While it is true that the prequels did have miniatures built, they were not used to nearly the same effect that they were with Lord of the Rings. Helm's Deep was huge at only a 1:4 scale, and the sets, whether digital or practical, are equally as impressive. Minas Tirith, Rivendell, the Shire are all brought to life in beautiful detail, and my dad swears up and down that the Mines of Moria are exactly how he pictured them when he read the books. And to shift gears a bit, both Lord of the Rings and the prequels made use of incredible new CGI technology. The opening space battle in Revenge is still one of my favorite scenes in sci-fi, and the massive program developed by Weta Workshop for Lord of the Rings is still used in many films today to shoot large battle sequences like the one on Pelennor Fields. One of the main reasons Lord of the Rings tends to resonate more with audiences than the prequels is writing. I know, big reveal, the adaptation of one of the greatest and best-selling book series of all time is good writing. But it's still important to keep in mind that Peter Jackson was given an incredible opportunity when New Line agreed to fund the entire trilogy of Lord of the Rings to the tune of almost $250 million. Originally, Miramax was to be the studio in charge of funding for Lord of the Rings, and had agreed to produce 2 movies with a combined budget of $75 million. However, when Jackson suggested that the films would probably cost about twice that, over $150 million in total, Miramax pushed back and said that they would only finance 1 movie, which would have meant cutting, as Peter Jackson described it, half the good stuff, including the Battle of Helm's Deep and combining Gondor and Rohan into one kingdom. After looking around Hollywood for a while with a 30-minute reel of what they'd already produced, they landed a deal with New Line. They would finance 3 movies, 1 for each book, at the total of $281 million in the total budget. This freedom allowed a mostly faithful adaptation of the books, and allowed audiences more time to connect with the characters, and more time to flesh out the world that they were building. And it paid off. The Lord of the Rings films grossed a combined total of almost $3 billion, a 10-fold return on investment. Now remember the effects software I talked about earlier, Massive? It caused a huge shift in the way fantasy movies were made by making large, epic battle sequences much more practical to film. The way this worked was that it would allow a program to algorithmically determine where computer-generated actors would move, rather than having to individually animate every soldier in a large army. You can see this in the glut of fantasy movies of middling quality that came out in the early 2000s after Lord of the Rings. I mean, particularly after 300 came out, and this kind of includes the Hobbit movies, sadly. Sometimes I wonder if we would have seen a sci-fi boom in the early 2000s like that which followed the original trilogy if the prequels had been a critical as well as a financial success. And I think the fact that there wasn't is telling. Before Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was known for mostly niche films, and the adaptation of the trilogy, for better or worse, elevated him to the levels of Spielberg and James Cameron. I feel like the glut of middling quality fantasy movies in the early 2000s is in part of a result of directors and studios trying to mimic what made Lord of the Rings so good, or at least mimicking 300. You can go on YouTube and look up clips of the Charge of the Rohirrim, or Fourth Erlingas, or the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, and you can feel some of the awe that those scenes inspire just whenever you want to. But not as much as if you've just sat through the hours of build-up that each of those moments have. And that's what separates the Lord of the Rings films from other worse fantasy films. Other movies want to have those epic moments, but skimp on character development and plot building. So the whole movie just feels more like an excuse to have a big CGI brawl than an actual story. And I feel like the best example of this, fittingly, is the Hobbit trilogy, which really brings the whole Lord of the Rings and prequels comparison full circle. You can see Jackson fall into some of the same pitfalls as Lucas, though partially more to a constrained schedule and studio wrangling than anything else. Lord of the Rings had years of pre-production before filming even started, both on the set and prop side and on the story side that just weren't there in The Hobbit. Thoughtful planning was a large part of what allowed the Lord of the Rings films to be great, and its absence is what caused The Hobbit and a lot of other early 2000s fantasy movies to not be great. It's the difference between having 3 years to plan out and prepare for one of the best movie trilogies of all time, and having to crank out some Greek slow-mo fest before people forget about 300. Good art can come out of adversity or a lack thereof, and it's important to remember that any director can be brought low by too much of either one.